Okay, so in this walkthrough, we're going to be taking a look at Space Invaders, and we're going to be using the Machine Jam for this. So a couple of pointers, if you're using the Machine Jam, just make sure you follow the instructions on the Native Instruments website to install the Ableton Live template, and we specifically want to use the Max for Live template, so just go to this webpage and just follow the instructions, and then when you're ready, you want to open the controller editor, and you want to ensure that the Ableton Live 9 Max for Live template is selected, and then you're good to go. Once you've downloaded the Arcade Series Returns pack, just double click it and install it. Just click yes on this box, and you should see the help view appear on the right hand side. You will also have here links to the online manuals for each of the arcade devices, so I would recommend checking those out as well. And you also have the pack installed over here on the left hand side, and if we go in here, we'll see quite a lot of devices. So for each of the 4 devices, there's a special version for each of the different controllers. So the Arcade Series Returns is compatible with all Launchpads, Mark 1, Mark 2, Launchpad Pro, Machine Jam, and Push 1 and Push 2. So we're using Space Invaders today, and I'm going to use this with Machine Jam. So I'll grab the Machine Jam version of Space Invaders, load that onto a MIDI track. So all the Arcade Series devices are MIDI devices. They're sequencers, so they're used to drive your either synthesizers or drum machines, and you can run them through other MIDI effects as well if you want. And they're all inspired by classic arcade games, and probably doesn't need much of an announcement, but Space Invaders was a classic. And what we've tried to do with this is to create a drum sequencer with a difference. So because it's a drum sequencer, we want to use a drum machine with this. I'm just going to use an 808 for now. Let's go through the good old 808 kit. So the first thing we want to do is to set up the controller. Whenever you load one of the arcade devices, or even if you reopen a project with a saved project with arcade devices in, you will need to press this button just here, just to refresh the menu of the connected controllers. This can change, depending on whether you've been using other controllers before when you last used the project. So click on that button to refresh, and then choose, in this case, Machine Jam. All of the controls for all the devices are similar in the way they use the control surfaces. They mainly use the 8x8 grid, and they use the scene launch buttons, which on Push and Launchpad are on the right hand side. Machine Jam, they are across the top, and they also make use of a shift button. So shift, I'm not using the shift button on the Machine Jam, instead of using the select button. But on Push, it's Shift, and Launchpad Pro, it's Shift. And then on the Launchpad Mark 1 and 2, it's the User 2 button. It also acts as a Shift button as well. Okay, so we've selected Machine Jam. And what we need to do now is we need to activate it. So we use on Machine Jam, we use Perform button to toggle whether the device, whether the controller, is being taken over by the device. Okay. With it on, we can see that it's taken over. It's changed some of the lights. What I'm going to do now is just pick one of the presets in here. There's a tiny little drop down menu here, and we can see we get this classic Space Invaders sort of interface that is also represented on the control surface. So let's just play it first of all. So what's happening is we can have up to 8 sequencers firing, which are represented by the little spaceships at the bottom, and they are shooting their lasers up, and the grid shows the invaders, which are just placed around the grid. And if I, for example, solo the kick drum, which is on this track here, the first one, we can see that it's hitting these. Now this isn't too different from a step sequencer, it's just that it's positioned going vertically rather than horizontally. What makes Space Invaders different is relevant to the game. The invaders don't have to remain static, they can move from left to right, and you can see the top row of invaders now are actually shifting right. So every now and again we get an extra hit for the kick, like there and there, but then we don't get one there. It depends on the pattern. So each invader can have a pattern. So to control this, let's go back here. I should mention as well, the control surface is only taken over whilst the device is selected. So if you do click between different devices, different tracks, normal behavior of the control surface is resumed. Only when you're on this track with the actual device does it actually take over. If you want to keep this locked to the device, so you can move around the tracks and keep Space Invaders locked to the track, click on the little device lock button here, and now when we change track, or even different devices on the same track, we still have control over the Space Invaders device. This can be useful if you have maybe 1 or 2 or 3 controllers and you want to use a different arcade device on each one of them. Okay, so let's go back to the device. So let's look at the patterns then. If I wanted to edit or change the settings of some of the invaders, that's what all of these controls here are showing me. Now we can toggle these whether we want to see them or not, so we can minimize them. And what we have are 8 rows of invaders. So if I choose this row here, this is showing me the top row of invaders, and the second one and the third one, and we see a representation of the pattern here. If we want to edit the pattern, there's 2 ways of doing this. One, we can just choose the invader row there and then add the invaders in. Now you can't edit these whilst they're moving, so if you do want to edit this top one, for example, that's running, just turn run off and edit and then restart it again. The other way of doing this is if you go to settings mode down here, then the grid no longer has its usual function, but instead it lets us add invaders. Like so. I'll come onto the settings in a moment. Where this can be really useful then is if you do have invaders that are running and it goes away from being a very standard sort of step sequencer that's quite limited by 8 steps, but by having the invaders rotating, and we can have them moving at different directions. They can go left and right, they can go in different speeds as well. But we can also choose things like the velocity, so we can say that every hit that hits the top row invaders could have a lower velocity. So the velocity settings in this case are specific to the invaders rather than the lasers that are hitting them. We can randomize the velocity. We can choose the note length if we need to. Okay, let's try another preset. Let's try one that's all running. Okay, to fire the lasers then, if you actually want to play with this, let's just turn these off for now. So there's no lasers firing at the moment. In fact, let's go back to a different sequencer. Turn these off again. You can fire the lasers by triggering any of the pads. And pressing the pad again re-triggers the laser. To do this, you do need to be in re-trigger mode. When re-trigger mode is not active, pressing a pad, any of the pads on this row will start and stop the laser. If I come out of there. So one starts, one stops. Okay, that's if you want to use it in a toggle way. If you want to be able to re-trigger the lasers or the sequencers, turn re-trigger on, come out of settings, and we can re-trigger the laser. And you can re-trigger from anywhere as well. You could trigger from a specific step if you need to. Okay, other settings we can play with then, as well as having separate settings for each of the rows of Invaders, we also have the settings section here. And over here we can control settings to do with the lasers. So what we're seeing here are the 8 lasers. Now the main things we can control are the rate. So we could say you're going to go a bit faster. So each laser can have its own rate, and we can also choose the note that's being triggered. This will be the default when you open the device up, and this will trigger the first 8 cells of a drum rack. But you could easily trigger this so it's triggering a different cell. When we're in settings mode as well, if you want to edit a row of Invaders, but that row of Invaders is currently moving, so let's say the first one, the top row here is moving, I can actually use the buttons now to stop it from moving, which lets me then edit it instead, and then I can restart it. As I said, on any other controller you'd be using the scene launch buttons on the side, which would correlate to each row. But I could, for example, edit this one here and then start it to run. Also, whilst we're in settings mode, we can use the grid to add accents. So to add accents, choose accent edit, and what happens now is the grid is adding the accent notes. Which will be louder, and you can choose here the depth of the accent and also what the maximum velocity of accents is, which is 127, and then that will obviously be 127 in velocity compared to whatever the current step or invader is. So if it's half, if it's 64, then your accent is going to be twice as loud as the current invader step. You can toggle the settings using the select button or the shift button on the other controllers. Space Invaders also has a scale mode, so if you do want to use it to trigger synthesizers, a lot tuned instruments rather than drums, then go to settings and turn scale on, and what you'll see is the note boxes that are showing the MIDI note that's currently being triggered will change to sliders. And what we have now is we can pick a scale like major, and when we press play, I've now got analog, and the sliders essentially they turn into like an analog sequencer. So we're still getting the same rhythmic triggers from the kind of rotating sequencer of Space Invaders, but we have these slider-based sequencer steps that conform to whatever scale we might choose. And we can choose a key and an octave. Space Invaders also has a swing section on it over here on the left hand side. If you turn this on, you can choose individually which of the 8 laser sequences has swing applied. So simply just turn that on, and then there's a slider to control the amount. If the button is orange, it means the swing is not being applied. Swing is only applied to 8th notes, 16th notes, and 32nd notes. It won't be applied to triplets or dotted notes. So if you do have a laser, for example, that is either in 4N or 16 note dotted, then it's going to be bypassed. If you switch that back to 16th notes, then it will work. Okay, and we also have a looper. So the looper is a MIDI looper. It captures the MIDI data being generated by this device and stores and loops it and plays it back internally. This can be useful if you're using a pattern or you've created a pattern that's maybe a little bit random, and what you want to do is capture a little section of it. So the looper can capture 1, 2, 4, or 8 bars. And it is linked to the time signature in live. So what I can do now is just click the middle button, and it will, when it passes around, start capturing a new loop, 2-bar loop, and then it starts playback. So what we're hearing now is the MIDI generated by the device. We're not actually hearing the sequences running, we're just hearing the MIDI that's been generated and captured by the looper. This can be useful in live performance if you just want to capture a little section and have it running rather than it doing sort of more random sequences, but also if you want to actually convert what you're doing into clips very easily, whilst that's captured, we can simply use the arrow buttons and click on the clip button, and we have a clip there. Let's just go for something a little less random. Okay, so that's captured that loop. Let's create a clip. I'll just choose an empty clip slot. Okay, so a really easy way of capturing what you're doing with the device, as opposed to having to set up a separate MIDI track and setting up all the routing. If you want to capture a new loop, just click again, and it will start recording a new loop. And if you want to stop, just click the red button, and then you're back to the sequencer. We also have a MIDI section here. The MIDI is just showing us how MIDI is being routed in and out of the device. By default, MIDI is off, which means any MIDI coming into the track from a controller or keyboard doesn't go anywhere into the device, and it doesn't pass through the device. If you do want to send MIDI through to the instrument, for example, that you're playing with, then just click through, and you can also click in, and what in does is it sends the MIDI into the device. This will only have an effect on this device if you're in the scales mode. So if you're in scales mode and you're triggering a synthesizer, having MIDI going in, if you press a key on the keyboard, it essentially changes the key, so it will match the if you hit C, it will trigger a C. If you hit E, it will shift the key of the sequencer to E. So it just allows you to play the key that the sequencer is running in from your keyboard if you wish to do so. That's only in the scale mode. It doesn't have any effect if you're in the default drum mode. Be sure to check out the online manuals for each of the arcade devices.